Throughout the medieval period, there were different harrowing execution methods deployed to bring the life of a condemned person to an end. Some of these were completely barbaric and included hanging, drawing and quartering, which had many different stages and steps, each one of these more awful than the one that came before. There was also the breaking wheel deployed across Europe, and this execution instrument involved the battering and brutalising of the victim who was tied to it, and people inside of France preferred seeing this used rather than the guillotine when it was introduced. There was actually a medieval English guillotine which was created, but this sometimes went wrong when it was used, allowing a prisoner to escape just before the axe fell upon their neck. Some even more terrifying medieval execution methods even involved the removal of flesh from a condemned person, and also burning at the stake. In this documentary we look at the different execution methods deployed during the time period. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. To be hanged, drawn and quartered was a very serious punishment, and possibly one of the most brutal administered in history. The punishment was seen as adequate justice for the attack on the authority of the English monarchy, and for this, the most extreme form of punishment was used. Treason as a crime had a rather wide meaning for the kings and queens who felt threatened during the medieval, Tudor and following eras. Henry VIII, for example, believed that simply predicting the death of a monarch was enough for someone to be condemned for this, and he had Elizabeth Barton, a woman who did this, executed for treason. But there were accounts during the Elizabethan period of a number of treasonous plots against the Tudor Queen, and because of this, scores of men were executed being hanged, drawn and quartered, following the plans to put Mary Queen of Scots on the throne, in schemes such as the Babington Plot. Hanging, drawing and quartering in its simplest form was an execution method that used a number of different stages, aimed to inflict great pain and suffering, but also aimed to shock the public. The point of this was to get the public to fall into line, and if they saw a brutal execution, they would be less likely to commit crimes such as treason because of it. The first part was a drawing, in which a prisoner would be collected from their place of incarceration, and then attached using a hurdle or a wooden frame. They would be tied to this, and then would be attached to the back of a horse, who would draw them through the streets. Sometimes the prisoner would not be tied to the wooden frame, and their head would bash against the cobbled streets, and they could also slip from the frame, and this would cause pain. They were paraded throughout the streets, where the public would often throw things and shout obscenities their way, before they were taken to a place of execution. They would be then handed over to an executioner, and would be hanged from a gallows or a wooden frame, until they were almost dead. If someone passed out, they would be revived, and some executioners, to inflict more suffering, would then hang them again. After this, the person was then disemboweled and emasculated, with their entrails pulled out, and then burned in front of them on a fire. Obviously this could easily kill, but often condemned individuals were forced to watch their parts being burned in front of them. They were then beheaded using an axe, and their body was cut into 4 pieces, with these being sent to different places in a country to be displayed, to act as a gory reminder of the people to behave themselves. Heads were also displayed in prominent places such as London Bridge after the execution. During the 13th and 14th century in England, those who were found guilty of treason were punished in many different ways, including drawing and hanging, but also more brutal ways such as beheading, disemboweling and even burning were used. It was said in the 13th century that a man who plotted and attempted to kill King Henry III was dragged asunder, then beheaded, and his body divided into 3 parts. Each part was then dragged through one of the principal cities of England, and afterwards hung on a gibbet, used for robbers. The first recorded examples of hanging, drawing and quartering were used during the reign of Edward I. Dafydd ap Gruffydd turned against Edward I and declared himself the Prince of Wales, and for this he was captured and then sentenced to what we would regard as high treason. Because of this, Dafydd was drawn through the streets of Shrewsbury near to the Welsh Marches, where he was then executed. He was dragged attached to a horse's tail and then hanged alive, before being revived and then disemboweled, eviscerated, and he was forced to watch his entrails being burned in front of him for sacrilege in committing his crimes in the week of Easter. After this, his body was cut into quarters for plotting to kill the king, and his remains were sent to different parts of England, to be displayed as a gory reminder to the people to fall into line. His right arm was sent to York, left arm sent to Bristol, right leg to Northampton, and left leg to Hereford, with his head placed on a spear at the Tower of London. William Wallace in 1305, the Scottish knight and military leader, classed as Braveheart, was also executed in London, following his capture in a similar way, and he was forced to wear a crown of laurel leaves as he was drawn through London to Smithfield, where he encountered the brutal punishment. Further executions in this manner occurred during the medieval period, but treason had not officially been outlined in law until the Treason Act 1351, which was passed by Edward III. This claimed that a monarch's right to rule was absolute, and that any questioning of this was seen as treason. It was also the monarch's duty to protect their throne and lands, and petty treason was also introduced, which outlined offences such as killing a lord or a master, and men found guilty of petty treason were drawn and hanged, and women were also burned at the stake. But it was high treason which was deemed the most serious offence. The Treason Act said that anyone was committing high treason if they committed a number of different offences. These were compassing or imagining the death of a king, his wife or eldest son and heir, violating the king's wife, his eldest daughter, if she were unmarried, or the wife of his eldest son or heir, levying war against the king in his realm, adhering to the king's enemies in his realm, giving them aid and comfort in his realm or elsewhere, counterfeiting the Great Seal or Privy Seal or the king's coinage, knowingly importing counterfeit money and killing the Chancellor, Treasurer, or one of the king's justices whilst performing their offices. With this, hanging, drawing and quartering was seen as a standard sentence for these offences. The execution of the 3rd Duke of Buckingham outlined his sentence in brutal fashion. He was executed in May 1521, and it was said he would be laid on a hurdle and so drawn to the place of execution, and there to be hanged, cut down alive, your members to be cut off and cast in a fire, your bowels burned before you, your head smited off, and your body quartered and divided at the king's will, and God may have mercy on your soul. During certain executions which featured a very angry crowd, they would often get involved in the killing process and shaming process. William Wallace was whipped and attacked by the crowd with rotten food, and rubbish was thrown at him. And a priest, Thomas Pilchard, who was executed for being a Catholic priest, it was said at the time, was barely alive when he reached his execution, before he was hanged, drawn and quartered. After the king's commission and the sentence of death had been read out, the crowd were then asked to move back from the scaffold, where the brutal practice was performed. Sometimes executioners or officials would ask questions to get the condemned person, following their drawing, to confess to their treason, and they were sometimes allowed to speak to the crowd. Often, other condemned people would be forced to watch others being executed in the same way beforehand. For example, in 1584, priest James Bell was forced to watch his friend being quartered. It is debated at what point someone would be dead along the process. Drawing, as mentioned, was very dangerous itself, often resulting in a prisoner's head being smashed against the ground. A victim may be conscious at the part of the ordeal where his entrails were burned, shortly before the head was removed and the body cut into 4 bits. It was said that during the execution of Major General Thomas Harrison, a man who signed the death warrant of King Charles I, that he was alive for several minutes after being hanged, and then when he was cut open and disemboweled, he then allegedly tried to hit the executioner, and because of this his head was cut off quicker. During disembowelment, John Houghton, it was said, began to pray before the final part of his ordeal occurred. One of the most famous people to be hanged, drawn and quartered was Guy Fawkes, one of the leading men involved in the Gunpowder Plot. Fawkes had been caught guarding the gunpowder in the undercrofts of the Houses of Parliament, and after his torture, which involved the rack, he was hanged, drawn and quartered. However, Fawkes jumped off the scaffold before in one final act of defiance, and its claim broke his neck before the sentence was carried out. The practice of hanging, drawing and quartering continued for centuries, and the accounts of them were very brutal. It was abolished in England by the Forfeiture Act of 1870, just over 150 years ago, which is shocking, considering how terrifying the practice was. Hanging and posthumous beheading replaced the old disemboweling and quartering in 1814, but it was still very brutal. The last hanging, drawing and quartering was of David Tyree in 1782. He was a Scotsman who had been caught corresponding with the enemy French. It was said of his execution, from the time he was put on the sledge till he came to the gibbet, he continued in an unconcerned conversation with the jailer, in which he expressed that he thought there were not three better, sounder, or honest hearts in the kingdom than his own, which was going to be burned. That there was only one thing which gave him concern, which was that his father was living, and he feared this misfortune would bring grey hairs with sorrow to the grave. He never hung his head the whole time. When arrived at the place of execution, no halter was provided, upon which he smiled and expressed astonishment as the inattention and neglect of his executioners, and indeed the business would have been slowed for some time, had not a rope and pulley been procured out of a lugger that lay upon the shore, during which time he read several passages in a Bible he carried in his hand. After hanging exactly 22 minutes, he was lowered upon the sledge, and his sentence literally put in execution. His head was severed from his body, his heart taken out and burned, his privateers cut off, and his body quartered. He was then put into a coffin and buried amongst the pebbles by the seaside, but no sooner had the officers retired, but the sailors dug up the coffin, took out the body, and cut it into 1,000 pieces, each one carrying away a piece of his body to show their messmates on board. A more dreadful, affecting execution was perhaps never seen. Hanging, drawing, and quartering was certainly one of the most sadistic execution methods used throughout history.
Bottle dungeons were as it is described in the name. They were a bottle shape, and these were dug inside of towers and castles, and they had a deep pit at the bottom, and then the entrance of the dungeon was higher and thinner. The bottle shape made it impossible for someone to escape from, and they could not climb out as the shape of the walls made this impossible. The bottle shape also meant that the pit would be a significant fall for someone if they were thrown into it, and they could either be cramped or rather spacious. As the centuries rolled on, the use of dungeons developed and changed over time, and these rooms also doubled up as torture chambers. Being deep underground, the screams of a prisoner could not be heard. One alleged oubliette in a Paris prison known as the Bastille was almost an upside-down bottle, as it had a narrow pit at the bottom, and it was larger at the top, but was secured inside of a tower of a different room. The access to these dungeons was usually through a heavy door or a hatch or trapdoor in the floor in the room above, and this meant to gain access someone would have to be thrown down there. The term bottle dungeon is sometimes considered another word for oubliette, and there was a narrow entrance at the top of the dungeon, and the room below was often also very narrow, that it was impossible to lie down. In Britain there are a number of examples of dungeons like this. Alnwick Castle, which today is famous for a certain wizarding film, close to the English-Scottish border, had chambers and dungeons inside of the gatehouse, which was considered an oubliette. These underground rooms were accessed through a door in the ceiling, and were built without toilets. But it's not known who was held inside these rooms. It certainly wasn't guards, but some have considered that if prisoners were not held inside these dungeons, then it's possible that treasure or valuables were secured in them underground. The oubliette of Warwick Castle is not necessarily a bottle shape. This is almost the entrance to a larger room. The small short dungeon opens up to a larger chamber later, and this has a latrine shaft which would enter the small room, and it was a partially backfilled drain. But there are accounts of prisoners being so fearful of Warwick Castle's dungeon during the 100 Years' War that they did anything not to fall into the hands of the English enemy. Bottle dungeons were also similar to pit prisons, where someone was thrown down a pit, and the difference was of course the shape of this room. One Scottish man who ended up inside of a bottle dungeon was David Beaton, the last Scottish cardinal before the Reformation and the Archbishop of St Andrews. It was said of his torture before his murder that Leslie wants the cardinal's body brought out of the dungeon and laid to rest somewhere more fitting. Will hangs his head over the bottle neck and quickly hauls it out again. The smell is bad, dank, airless and putrid. Surely the cardinal can't still be rotting after more than a year pickled in salt. Bottle dungeons were a feared part of a castle's imprisonment system, and they were usually basement rooms deep underground, which were only accessible from a hatch or a hole in the high ceiling. The shape prevented escape if there was ever a chance of surviving, and sometimes the fall from the entrance hatch to the floor of the dungeon was so significant that it could cause severe injuries itself. There was little to no chance of escape from the bottle dungeon. One of the earliest beheading devices or machines was known as the Halifax Jibit.
This was installed in the town of Halifax in West Yorkshire in England, and it was an alternative execution method to using axe. The device was made up of an axe head fitted to the base of a heavy block that would pass through grooves in two wooden, 15 feet upright pieces of wood. A rope was attached to the block, and this ran over a pulley, which allowed it to be raised and then locked into place through the use of a pin. The block holding the axe was then released, and this would then fall onto the neck of a prisoner. There were, it's believed, around 100 people beheaded in Halifax between 1286 and 1650, but the installation of the gibbet is not certain with regards to its date. In the 17th century, the use of the device was actually banned by Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell, and the Halifax Jibit was then taken down. There are, though, 52 people who were certainly known to have been beheaded on the device. Someone could be executed if they were accused of stealing something to the value of today what would be classed as £10. It was said that, if a felon be taken within their liberty or precincts of the said forest, as in the forest of Hardwick, either hang habend, caught with the stolen goods in his hand or in the act of stealing, backaband, caught carrying stolen goods on his back, or confessand, having confessed to the crime, cloth or any other commodity to the value of 13.5 pence, then they shall, after 3 market days or meeting days within the town of Halifax, after such his apprehension, and being condemned, he shall be taken to the gibbet, and there have his head cut from his body. This was known as Halifax Jibit law, and during the reign of King Edward I in 1278, it was known that there were 94 privately owned gibbets and gallows, which were being used and operated inside of Yorkshire, just one county, but the use of the one in Halifax remained for many centuries. What would happen with this gibbet is that a prisoner would be condemned to death, and the days before his execution he would be locked in custody for 3 market days, and during these the condemned was displayed publicly in the stocks to show everyone what they had done. Then they would be brought out to the gibbet and placed under it. The gibbet could be operating by cutting the rope or pulling out a pin, and if an animal was stolen, then the cord could be fastened to this animal, which would then be driven away and be the one that released the axe to fall onto someone's neck. It was said in one account that, in the nether end of the sliding block is an axe keyed or fastened with an iron into the wood, which being drawn up to the top of the frame is there fastened by a wooden pin. Unto the middest of the which pin also there is a long rope fastened that cometh down among the people, so that when the offender hath made his confession, and hath laid his neck over the nethermost block, every man there present doth either take hold of the rope, or putteth forth his arm so near to the same as he can get, in token that he is willing to see true justice executed, and pulling the pin out in this manner, the head block wherein the axe is fastened doth fall down with such violence, that if the neck of the transgressor was so big of that of a bull, it should be cut in sunder at a stroke, and roll from the body by a huge distance. There were some issues with the gibbet though, especially as some criminals could escape the scaffold before the blade fell onto their neck. One man who did this managed to free himself, as there was no restraint, and he then managed to run the roughly 500 yards out of the county boundary, and he managed to escape punishment, as he was not under the jurisdiction of the gibbet law. One silly man escaped the gibbet, but then later came back to Halifax, and he was actually finally executed in 1623, 7 years after he had escaped from the gibbet. In Scotland they had the maiden, which was also known as the Scottish maiden, and this was an early form of the guillotine that was used within Edinburgh during the 16th and 18th century. It was introduced during the reign of Mary Queen of Scots, and it was first used for the final time, in the year 1716. But the device also was around years before the French Revolution. In Scotland it's believed that the maiden came around as there were problems with swords being lent for executions, and that the maiden was developed by carpenters who had been paid for their work to create a new beheading machine. What they devised was a scaffold with an axe blade that also fell, and a peg kept the blade in place, and when this was removed the blade would then fall and take the head off the condemned. It worked in a very similar way to the Halifax Jibit, and extra weight was added to increase the speed of the axe's fall. The first execution using the maiden on record took place on the 3rd of April 1565, as Thomas Scott of Cambus Michael lost his head on it.
The device could then be moved to different locations all around Edinburgh, and it was taken down relatively easily when it was needed, and it could be put down and then put back up very quickly. And then executions were carried out at different places around Edinburgh, such as at the Grassmarket, or on Castle Hill, near to Edinburgh Castle, or even at the Mercat Cross, another famous place of execution. It was even lent and rented out to different towns and cities, for example, the nearby town of Leith, for the execution of a man named William Gibson, utilised the Edinburgh Maiden, and it was successful at this time. But during the reign of King James VI, and during his regency, the 4th Earl of Morton, Regent James Douglas, was executed on the Maiden in 1581. The very man who brought the device to Scotland lost his head on it, which is rather remarkable considering this also happened to the French King Louis XVI, who introduced the guillotine to his nation and then also lost his head on it. It was said that his execution, the Regent's, was also a success. Further executions using the Maiden claimed the lives of Archibald Campbell, the first Marquess of Argyll, and also his son, the 9th Earl of Argyll. The final execution using the Scottish Maiden occurred on the 30th of June 1716, and this was of a man named John Hamilton, who allegedly murdered a publican or a pub owner during a big brawl. These devices were both predecessors of the French guillotine, and of course there are a number of differences, the most prominent being the use of a slanted blade for the guillotine rather than using a simple axe head. Both the Halifax Jibit and the Scottish Maiden are rather rudimentary beheading machines. They utilise an axe rather than a blade, and this obviously is not as reliable as using a sharpened blade. They did tend to learn a little bit more when they devised the guillotine in France from these devices, and they worked out what could go well and what could not. For example, the guillotine locked people into place. The Halifax Jibit did not, and people could even escape. But the guillotine took inspiration from both of the devices, and they were in a sense efficient in their use. However, there are accounts of things going wrong with them, but it's remarkable to think that the British came up with these devices that were known for executions, and they inspired the guillotine, a device which for many symbolised the revolution, but for many others symbolised oppression, slaughter and death within France after the execution of the King and Queen.
The gibbet was usually a wooden structure in which a metal cage in the shape of a body could be hanged up to or hanged on, and the point of this was to show the remains of a dying criminal or a dead criminal for some time. It was known as being hanged in chains and was a punishment used in England, and following the passing of the 1751 Murder Act, judges were given the power to use gibbeting as a sentence passed upon those convicted of murder. There were many examples of other crimes in which someone would be gibbeted alive for, including theft and stealing sheep and piracy. It was also used for those condemned for treason, and was used for executing highwaymen, and these criminals' remains would be placed next to crossroads or public highways to put other potential thieves off committing crimes. Pirates were also gibbeted close to the low water mark or a tidal part of a river and on a river bank, so sailors would be greeted with the swinging bodies as they came into port. The bodies of pirates would be left dangling, and they would be left for days, until they were submerged by the tide at least 3 times. Others were left for some time in the gibbet. Execution Dock, which is found in London in the Wapping area, is where many criminals and pirates were hanged in cages along the River Thames. Ships would pass under the bodies of convicted pirates, and these would keep people in line. Some people did complain about the dead bodies hanging up in the cages because of the sight and smell of the decaying corpses, and they complained that these were actually a health hazard, and many believed that smells were linked to disease spreading. But others, such as foreign visitors, did not believe in the brutal display of the remains of someone. Sometimes with gibbeting, cages were not always used, but it was used to keep the condemned person locked in a cage. It was said of a gibbeting cage that the body was encased in flat bars of iron, 2.5 inches in breadth. The feet were placed in stirrups, from which a bar of iron went up each side of the head and ended in a ring, of which he was suspended. A bar from the collar went down the breast, another down the back. There were also bars inside the legs, which communicated with the above, and crossbars at the ankles, the knees, the thighs, the bows, the breast and shoulders. The hands were hung by the side and covered with pitch. The face was pitched and covered with a piece of white cloth.
Gibbeting was of course also the display of human remains, and during the Tudor period, famously many heads of traitors were placed above London Bridge after they had their date with an executioner at Tower Hill. It was also used in different countries. For example, in Germany, a Jewish financier, Joseph Suss Oppenheimer, was gibbeted in a human-sized birdcage, which was then placed outside of Stuttgart. Hitler would later use this event to try and propagate stories against the Jews before the Second World War. Also, the bodies were often covered in tar and were bound in chains, and with the tarring of the victims, this was meant to keep away decay and to preserve the remains as long as possible. In East Sussex in England, one man who had murdered was hanged and then gibbeted for more than 20 years inside of an iron cage, with his remains continuing to be suspended in the air. But many of those inside of cities and towns would be taken aback by the sight of the dead hanging from the cages. In Australia, the body of a murderer named John Mackay was gibbeted close to a spot where he murdered his victim in Tasmania. This caused a lot of controversy, and the body would not be removed until a friend of the victim actually asked for it to be taken down, as he believed the decaying corpse was too much, and he believed he could not get over the death whilst the murderer's body remained suspended in the air. Some criminals were gibbeted alive, and they would be locked in the cage and then suspended in the air, and there was no way out for them. Over a long period of time, criminals would slowly die from starvation and exposure, as it was known, meaning exposure to the elements and the weather. People would walk past daily and would see the slow deterioration of the person as they lost weight and slowly succumbed to their painful death as people below mocked them. It was usually always men who were gibbeted, as female bodies of murderers were in high demand from doctors and surgeons who would carry out public dissections for science and medicine, and there were many people in the crowd who would then witness this. It was a popular way of seeing punishment being carried out, but often flies would feast on the rotting remains, as would crows, ravens, and other animals. The smell would be terrible, and people nearby living near a gibbet had to keep their windows closed and shut, and the decay would often take place for many years. Bones of the condemned, once the flesh had been picked from them, would often fall onto the floor. There would be at times attempts to take someone out of the gibbet to spare them, but some blacksmiths made severe efforts to make sure the gibbet cage could not be opened. One gibbet was even covered with 12,000 nails to stop someone touching it. They were also very expensive to make. In England, the final gibbeting of someone took place in Leicester, as James Cook, a bookbinder, murdered another man. In front of Leicester Prison on the 10th of August 1832, he was executed, and it was then said that the head was shaved and tarred to preserve it from the action of the weather, and the cap in which he had suffered was drawn over his face. On Saturday afternoon, his body, attired as at the same time of his execution, having been firmly fixed in the irons necessary to keep the limbs together, was carried to the place of its intended suspension. Cook's body was then placed on a specially built 10-metre high gallows near to a toll gate in Leicester, and it was said of his gibbeting, thousands of persons were attracted to the spot to view this novel but most barbarous exhibition, and considerable annoyance was felt by persons resident in the neighbourhood of the dreadful scene. Representations were in consequence made to the authorities, and on the following Tuesday morning, instructions were received from the Home Office directing the removal of the gibbet. Gibbeting was one of the most barbaric and brutal practices used in history. There were many who would witness a public display of the remains of a criminal. It was meant to serve as a painful reminder that justice had been done, and was meant to keep people off committing crimes. But it was considered by some to be too far, and if you passed under the gibbet cage, you would not forget what you saw, and it might keep you up at night. The gallows was the execution structure in which people were hanged upon, following being given their death sentences. They were, as mentioned, adapted throughout history, and the Americans even developed a variant known as the upright jerker, in which the victim would be sent high up into the air, jerking upwards as a counterweight fell, and this was aimed to also break the neck of the condemned. This was also created as an attempt to make the gallows more reliable. However, throughout the centuries, the gallows did not even use a trapdoor, and it was just a frame for someone to be hanged upon. Executioners would pass a rope over the gallows and secure the noose around the neck, and then pull down on the rope, and they would literally choke the life out of someone as they were hoisted into the air and taken off their feet. But even a horse and cart was used in gallows executions. Hanging people from earlier forms of gallows involved securing the noose around someone's neck, whilst they were either stood on a ladder or on the back of a horse-drawn cart, which had been backed up underneath the wooden structure. Then either the ladder would be removed, or the horses would be driven away, which led to someone dangling from the gallows by their neck, and they would then slowly strangle to death. One famous execution which was carried out in this manner, and documented, was that of a British spy named John Andre, and it was said of his execution that, while waiting and standing near the gallows, I observed some degree of trepidation, placing his foot on a stone and rolling it over and choking in his throat, as if attempting to swallow. So soon, however, as he perceived that things were in readiness, he stepped quickly onto the wagon, and at this moment he appeared to shrink, but instantly elevating his head with firmness, he said, "It will be a monumentary pang," and taking from his pocket 2 white handkerchiefs, the Provost Marshal, with one, loosely pinioned his arms, and with the other the victim, after taking off his hat and stock, bandaged his own eyes with a perfect firmness, which melted the hearts and moistened the cheeks, not only of his servant, but of the throng of spectators. The rope being appended to the gallows, he slipped the noose over the head, and adjusted it to his neck, without the assistance of the awkward executioner. Colonel Scammell now informed him that he had the opportunity to speak if he desired it. He raised the handkerchief from his eyes and said, "I pray you bear me witness that I meet my fate like a brave man." The waggon being now removed from under him, he was suspended, and instantly expired. It proved indeed but a momentary pang. Horses and carts were used commonly during history for the executions, and they were a step which was removed to bring the life of someone to an end. It came before the use of trapdoors, and the victim would die from strangulation rather than a broken neck. But after the Second World War, during one set of executions, this horse and cart gallows system inspired the deaths of many notorious concentration camp guards. The female and male guards of Stutthof concentration camp were all led up to a huge set of gallows which they were executed upon, but instead of using horse and carts as a step whilst the noose was secured, the executioners, some who were actually former prisoners of the Stutthof camp themselves, led the condemned onto the back of open-backed trucks, which were then reversed under the gallows. These were then, when the time was ready, driven off, and the condemned guards were left there hanging from the gallows by their necks.
People were either wheeled or broken on the wheel, and this execution and torture method would take place on scaffold sites for thousands of people to watch. The aim was to put the public off carrying out the same sort of crimes. The execution wheel was usually a large wooden wheel which had a number of spokes inside, similar to a wagon cart wheel, and it could be modified. Someone would be strapped onto the wheel, and the first point of the wheel was to cause mutilation and brutal injuries on the body. Firstly, the execution would begin with the breaking of a condemned person's legs, and this was usually done with the wheel being dropped onto the legs of the victim, and they would then also drop this onto other parts of the body, such as arms, shattering them. This was very painful, and the victim was usually wedged between wood to cause more pain. Sometimes these bits of wood had sharp edges on, which would then embed into the person. Following this, the executioner could then kill them by aiming the wheel at the victim's heart or neck. But there was often a second act of the breaking wheel, and the body of the victim was attached to another wooden spoked wheel, which was then attached onto a mast or pole for the crowd to see. It could even display someone on a mast, which would act as a crucifixion almost. Sometimes executioners would behead the prisoner or garrote them, if needed, and they would also batter the victim with wooden clubs, shattering further bones between the spokes. Sometimes wheeled prisoners were then thrown on a fire after the execution was carried out. The body would also be left out for days on end to decay, and it would then be picked at by the birds and other animals. In some cases, if the victim fell from the wheel still alive, or if the execution somehow failed, this was seen as God intervening to save the condemned, and they would then be cut down, however brutal the injuries were that they had sustained. There were accounts of people surviving a substantial time following an ordeal on the breaking wheel, with some people remaining attached to the wheel conscious for days on end. It's considered that the wheel could have emerged from France, but in the country the condemned were placed on a cartwheel. They then had their limbs stretched out along the spokes. The wheel was then turned slowly, and a hammer or iron bar was smashed onto the limbs, breaking them. This would continue even when the limbs were broken, and an executioner could take mercy on the victim by hitting them in the chest or abdomen. Usually shock or dehydration in this manner caused death, and in France people were sometimes strangled to death also before the breaking may begin. It was also used by the Holy Roman Empire for men who had committed murder, but those who had committed less serious crimes were also beaten on the wheel. More barbaric criminals were broken feet first, with the breaking of their legs, with the ordeal lasting for hours. One serial killer in 1581 was guilty of 544 murders, and over the course of 2 horrific days, he was tortured and executed on the wheel, with 42 strikes breaking his bones. There was one account in 1786 in which the breaking wheel was used in what today is Germany, in which the execution on the wheel was considered botched. Heinrich Doller was executed on the wheel for murder, and it was said that the first stroke of the wheel should have crushed his chest, and that this would usually kill. However, when the first strike happened, Doller was still alive, and was alive throughout the whole of his breaking, when all of his limbs were shattered after the numerous brutal strikes. Doller was confirmed as being alive when he was raised on a pole and left to die, and it took him 6 hours to succumb to his fate. It was said that inadequate weight meant his chest had not been crushed, and that a nail which was hammered through his brain had been hammered in too low not to kill him. The method was even used in India, and also was used in Britain. In Scotland, a servant, Robert Weir, was broken on the wheel in Edinburgh in 1603, and it was used rarely in the country, with only murderers really being broken. It was even used during slave rebellions and in executing those who were involved in these. 11 slaves were killed using it in French Louisiana in the 18th century, who escaped their masters, and it was a common deterrent. It was also used in Russia and also in Sweden, where an eyewitness said of an execution on the breaking wheel, "Here the executioners gave him the first stroke. His cries were terrible, of the utmost horror, for as the headsman had no skill in his business, the wretch under his hands received upwards of 15 blows, with each of which were intermixed with the most piteous groans and invocations of the name of God. At length, after 2 strokes given on the breast, his strength and voice failed him. In a faltering, dying tone, he was just heard to say, 'Cut off my head,' and the executioner still lingering, he himself placed his head on the scaffold. In a word, after 4 strokes with a hatchet, the head was separated from the body, and then the body was quartered. Such was the end of the renowned Patkul, and may God have mercy on his soul." It was even used in Germany in the 1800s to take lives, and was still in use in 1836 in Hesse Castle. There have been many archaeological discoveries involving those who were executed on the breaking wheel, with their injuries showing how brutal the execution method really was. A famous case of its use is during the execution of St. Catherine, who was sentenced to be tortured and killed on the wheel, but when she touched it, it allegedly shattered before she was then later beheaded. However, the breaking wheel was a barbaric method of execution that was used on the European continent mainly. There are huge numbers of accounts of how brutal the practice was, and to see someone being beaten so savagely in this manner would have been very traumatic for someone to observe. Today, examples of breaking wheels can be found in museums and around the world, and upon these, such suffering must have occurred. Flaying of humans has been used throughout history as a method of execution and also torture, and it could be fatal if more skin was removed, and this was also said to have been known as flaying alive. The skin of someone could be removed also after death, and the desecration of the corpse could be linked to preventing someone getting into the afterlife for their crimes.
But it was also said that the cause of death when it came to flaying was from shock, a huge amount of blood loss, and also infection caused to the area where the skin had been removed. Death could also occur a number of hours and even a few days after the skin had been removed from an area, and also as the skin provides a significant degree of natural insulation to the body, victims could also die from hypothermia. It was claimed that flaying took place during the Neo-Assyrian times, and that flaying is seen inside of images. These images show the Assyrians flaying their prisoners alive. The carvings show the prisoners are being flayed on their thighs and on other body parts such as their lower legs, but the kings of this time seemed to be very happy, and they boasted about their actions in flaying prisoners alive, and it was a punishment method given out to rebel leaders. It was claimed that, "I have made a pillar facing the city gate, and have flayed all the rebel leaders. I have clad the pillar in their flayed skins. I let the leaders of the conquered cities be flayed, and clad the city walls with their skins. The captives I have killed by the sword, and flung on the dung heap." An artefact known as a Rassam cylinder, housed inside of the British Museum, says on this, "Their corpses they hung on stakes. They took off their skins and covered the city wall with them." Flaying, or the removal of flesh, was also performed during the medieval period in Europe for those who were executed for being traitors, as this was seen as a very serious problem. In England in 1303, the treasury of Westminster Abbey was robbed, and a lot of money was stolen that belonged to King Edward I. This was a very serious crime, and Edward, who was known as the Hammer of the Scots, was known for being someone who you did not want to steal from. He then had 48 monks arrested and interrogated, and there were 3 monks, including senior figures within Westminster Abbey, who were found guilty of stealing from the king, and these were then flayed. The skin of these monks was then hanged from 3 doors to serve as a stark warning not to steal from the king. But inside of China, the practice was also used to remove skin from the faces of many corrupt government officials, but it was a brutal and barbaric execution method which was very feared. During the Viking raids in England, the Vikings were said to have flayed Londoners in 991 AD, and allegedly human skin was even found on a church door. In 1831, following the execution of Nat Turner, a slave rebellion leader in Virginia, his body was flayed, and his skin was even used to make purses for souvenirs. Flaying was linked to some of the most brutal and ruthless dynasties and leaders throughout history, and it was without doubt a terrifying execution and torture method.
Burning at the stake has been around for thousands of years. It was recorded in the 18th century BC by a Babylonian king that there were specific crimes which people could be executed by burning for. This included people who looted the houses of others, or priestesses who abandoned their churches and began to spend time in certain pubs and taverns. In ancient Egypt, there were examples of people who were being used as human torches, and certain pharaohs and rulers showed no mercy. Some women who committed adultery could be burned to death, and the pharaoh had to personally sign off the verdicts of these who were to be burned to death. Some people who were involved in the assassination of Ramesses III were burned alive, and this was done as the Egyptians believed someone could not get into the afterlife without their body. There are accounts in the ancient books and holy books of people who were burned alive. In Genesis, Judah ordered the widow of his son to be burned when she believed she had an adulterous affair. She did save herself, but in Hebraic law, death by burning was administered for a number of crimes. The manner of burning in the Mishnah states that the obligatory procedure for execution by burning, they immersed him in the dung up to his knees, rolled a rough cloth into a soft one and wound it about his neck. One pulled it one way, one the other until he opened his mouth. Thereupon one ignites a lead wick and throws it in his mouth, and it descends to his bowels and sears his bowels. Romans also executed many Christian martyrs by burning, including that of a Christian bishop named Polycarp. He was forced to wear a flammable tunic, and it was said the Christian, stripped naked, was forced to put on a garment called the tunica molesta, made of papyrus, smeared on both sides with wax, and was then fastened to a high pole, from the top of which they continued to pour down burning pitch and lard, a spike fastened under the chin, preventing the excruciated victim from turning the head to either side, so as to escape the liquid fire until the whole body and every part of it was literally clad and cased in flame. Constantine increased the crimes that someone could be burned for, and they were allowed an appeal before their sentence was carried out. Some also had molten lead poured down their throats. The Celts also had a practice of burning humans alive in a number of ways. Julius Caesar wrote of the sacrifice of criminals in huge wicker frames, known as wicker men. It was said, "Others have figures of vast size, the limbs of which, formed of osires, they fill with living men, which being set on fire, the men perish, enveloped in flames. They consider that the oblation of such as have been taken in theft or in robbery, or any other offence, is more acceptable to the immortal gods, but when a supply of that class is wanting, they have recourse of the oblation of even the innocent." The Celts performed this on the occasion of the death of important men, and there was funeral sacrifice of burning in this ritual. But during the medieval period, the punishment of burning alive or burning at the stake was strongly linked to the crime of heresy or religious offences. Anyone who dared to question the teachings of the Catholic Church could be burned alive. There were large-scale executions of heretics, and anyone who was deemed a threat to religion could be executed in this way. Prominent reformers such as Jan Hus was burned at the stake, and the remains of John Wycliffe were exhumed 30 years after his death and were then burned. There are also many accounts throughout Europe during the medieval period of Jews who were often burned alive, and this was the case in England too. For example, in York, many Jews were barricaded in the castle there, which then caught fire, causing a huge scene of devastation. But this scene was played out in many European cities. For example, in Basel and Strasbourg, hundreds of Jews were burned alive. In France in 1321, there were also leper hunts, who it was believed had poisoned the wells, and the lepers were rounded up and were burned alive, with around 5,000 people being burned in this hysteria. One of the most brutal regimes of the medieval period that instigated a reign of terror and burned thousands of people at the stake was the Spanish Inquisition, which was established in 1478. It's believed that during the 300 years of Inquisition activity, that up to 50,000 people were burned at the stake in horrifying scenes across Spain and its occupied territories. Many of these burnings occurred simultaneously, with more than one person being burned at the same time. But as well as being the punishment for heresy, it was also linked to witchcraft punishments. It's believed that dozens of thousands, if not millions, of women were executed by being burned alive, by being considered to have been witches. For example, Joan of Arc was even considered to have been a witch. But in England, as mentioned, Mary I was one of the most notorious queens, and she became known for her Marian persecutions, or burnings of Protestants at the stake. Despite Mary being famous for this, burnings had occurred in England for centuries before, but also they continued centuries after her reign. One English burning was captured in writing by an eyewitness, and it was said of the last woman burned alive that, the fuel being placed round her and lighted with a torch, she begged for the sake of Jesus to be strangled first, whereupon the executioner drew tight the halter, but the flame coming to his hand in the space of a second he let it go, when she gave 3 dreadful shrieks, but the flames taking her on all sides, she was heard no more, and the executioner, throwing a piece of timber into the fire, it broke her skull, when her brains came plentifully out, and in about an hour more she was reduced to ashes. In Scotland, the King James VI's interest in witchcraft also led to many women being burned at the stake. In North America, the indigenous population often used burning as an execution method against white settlers or other tribes, and they slowly roasted people over a fire. Some slaves were also burned at the stake, and this often happened with victims being killed first. There have been other methods of applying fire to execute someone, including the brazen bull, where someone was thrown into a metal structure shaped like a bull, and they were then roasted alive as the metal bull heated up. Even during the Second World War, there are examples of people being burned alive. For example, there were atrocities in which the Germans locked people inside barns, and then set them on fire. There were even reprisals against Germans in which some were burned alive. There was an account at the Ebensee concentration camp in which an SS guard who tried to flee was roasted to death in an oven. But this is only the start with regards to the execution method of burning. There were many different variations of the execution method, and throughout the centuries millions must have been executed in this way. It was a terrible way to go, and was a horrifically painful and savage death for someone to experience. Impalement was used as a method of torture and execution, and it involves having a wooden stake, metal pole, spear, or any other instrument being driven through the torso or part of the body. It was used as a public method of execution to send a clear message to the people in which crimes against a king, ruler or government would not be tolerated. It was considered a very brutal and horrific method of capital punishment and execution, and it was used at times to punish rebels, traitors, and those who had gone against the rules of the military. Often some crimes that were hated by the population were punished by impalement, and examples were made of those who did such things, such as robbing graves, or those who were highwaymen or robbers. There were different methods of impalement, and one of them was longitudinal impalement. This is where an individual would be impaled through their body in a vertical manner. This was used in many different countries, and one account of an impalement from Egypt in the 1600s unveiled how brutal it was. It was said, they lay the malefactor upon his belly, with his hands tied behind his back, then they slit up his fundament with a razor, and throw it into a handful of paste that they have in readiness, which immediately stops the blood. After that they thrust up into his body a very long stake, as big as a man's arm, sharp to the point and tapered, which they grease a little before, when they have driven it in with a mallet, till it comes out at his breast, or its head or shoulders. They lift him up and plant the stake very straight in the ground, upon which they leave him so exposed for a day. One day I saw a man on a pole, who was sentenced to continue so for 3 hours alive, and that he might not die too soon. The stake was not thrust far enough to come out at any part of his body, and they also may put a stay or rest upon the pole, to hinder the weight of his body from making him sink down upon it, or the point of it from piercing through him, which would have presently killed him. In this manner he was left for some hours, during which time he spoke, and turning from one side to another, prayed those that passed by to kill him, making 1,000 wry mouths and faces, because of the pain he suffered when he stirred himself. But after dinner the basher sent one to dispatch him, which was easily done, by making the point of the stake come out at his breast, and he was left there till next morning, when he was taken down because it stunk horridly. In terms of how long someone could survive through longitudinal impalement, depending on where the stake or spike would be placed. Some people would live a few seconds if their internal organs were penetrated by the spike, or some could live a few hours and even a few days. In the Dutch East Indies, it was noted that one man survived 6 days whilst being impaled, and some surgeons claimed someone could last longer than 8 days, but this depended on how the stake was stuck through the body. If the stake was inserted to follow the spine, then the impalement would not necessarily damage vital organs, meaning that someone could last longer. The other type of impalement was transversal impalement. This was where a spike was pushed through the body from the front to the back. This meant a spike would be driven through the chest or sometimes through the heart, and in the Holy Roman Empire this was used for women who were accused and found guilty of killing their children. They were placed in open graves, and a stake was hammered through their heart, almost like witches. In one account a grave was dug, and a woman was placed in it and her hands and feet hammered into the ground, with nails being driven through them. The executioner then put a thorn bush on her face, then drove a wooden stake through the heart, and the assistants of the executioner then buried her. After the grave was covered up, a red-hot iron rod was then hammered through the woman's body, and a scream was heard. Gorching was another form of impalement, where a condemned victim was hoisted up onto a rope over a sharp row of metal hooks. When released, they would fall onto the hooks, and these would impale in the body. In the city of Algiers, hooks were embedded in the walls of the city, where people would be thrown from the battlements, and then they were impaled in the hooks. It was said they are hung up by the neck over the battlements of the city walls, or else they are thrown upon the hooks that are fixed all over the walls below, where sometimes they break from one hook to another, and stay in the most exquisite torments 30 or 40 hours. Other variations of impalement include hanging by the ribs, where someone was impaled with an iron meat hook through the ribs, and then they were left to die slowly, and also bamboo torture, used by the Japanese upon prisoners of war during the Second World War. A victim would be tied above a bamboo shoot, but the fast, sharp-growing shoot would then go through a victim's body. In Europe, impalement was used for a huge amount of crimes, including heresy and murder. Often crimes which were considered so brutal included a number of different execution methods, including being broken on the breaking wheel, but then someone would also be impaled afterwards. So a victim would be beaten on the wheel before being impaled, and their misery would be condemned. Also, beheading was used with impalement, meaning that they would have their heads cut off before a stake was driven through their corpse. But it's Vlad the Impaler who's considered the most notable user of the execution method. During the 15th century, he would go on to harshly deal with many of his enemies using impalement, and there were scores of people who were killed in this way. It was said in the capital of Vlad's lands there was a forest of 20,000 impaled and decaying corpses, and this even put the Turks off invading Vlad's lands. He was even the inspiration for the character of Dracula, such was his brutality and violence. But impalement was a shocking method of execution that carried a horrific visual for the enemies of a king or a ruler. Vlad the Impaler's use of the method resulted in a huge propaganda boost, and many different people around the world feared his wrath and would not dare to invade his country. It was a savage way of killing, and within the method there were other ways that different rulers put their spin on the method. It punished a huge variety of crimes, from heresy to treason and murder. Today it's remembered as the weapon of Vlad the Impaler, but also as a brutal execution method that today is not seen or witnessed around the world.
Dahl trees were used as gallows for public executions and hangings. They were used as gibbets to publicly display the remains and corpse of someone for sometimes years after the execution had taken place. The point of this was to strike fear into the hearts of the locals, so they would not commit serious crimes, as they would literally see the remains of someone decaying and rotting day after day. Dahl trees were also known as a method in Roman times for punishing and hanging slaves, but inside of Scotland in the 12th century, the trees were used prominently as gallows. They were also known as the grief tree, the gallows tree, or the justice tree, and local people just knew them as the tree, due to the notoriety they had because of what happened there. They were used by Highland chieftains, who hanged their enemies from them, to send a message to other clan chiefs, and they did this often on high ground, so that people from miles away would be able to see. When James V became the king, he tried to bring order back to Scotland, and he ordered all earls, lords, barons, gentlemen and freeholders to meet at Edinburgh, bringing a month's supplies with his army of 12,000 men, and he offered safety for a laird to meet him in Scotland or England. This man, Johnny Armstrong, had powerful men, and he was seen as a possible threat to the throne, but Johnny and his men were later hanged in the trees of the Caerleigh and Rig churchyard, and the trees following these executions were said to have died from shame, and a local legend exists that no tree or plant has ever since grown in this ground. Usually when an execution was carried out on the Dahl tree, the condemned was brought out in front of the crowd and was then hoisted up into the air, and the noose was then tied and secured around their necks before they were let go. Also, people had their lives strangled out of them on the tree, and they would kick and struggle, and it was not a quick process, unlike hanging using a gallows and the long drop. There are a number of these hanging trees which still exist today, and many have dark stories. One of the best surviving trees is in the grounds of Leaf Hall, and this sycamore tree was used as a gibbet and also a gallows, and the strong tree made it ideal by local lawmakers to execute on it. Other Dahl trees include the one at Cassilius Castle in Ayrshire, which was blown down during a storm in the Second World War years, and it was many years old, and a new tree was planted based on a cutting taken from the old tree. It was here where Johnny Farr, a man known as the King of the Gypsies, was hanged on the Dahl tree, along with some of his supporters. There are many other examples of hanging trees which have been used throughout the years all over the world, and many still do exist. But the use of a tree instead of a gallows was said to have been much cheaper than creating a gallows, and it was also quicker to condemn someone on a tree rather than build and erect a gallows. The fact that trees were used to gibbet the remains of someone is also shocking, and shows the brutal nature of chieftains and local leaders in Britain. It would have been very common to ride a horse throughout different lands, seeing people hanging from trees to send a clear message to others not to mess with them. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.